19-year-old Frank Sinatra Jr. walks out of Harrah's casino after finishing his first real professional gig. He's nervous, excited, his hands are still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of performing. For 3 nights, he's been singing to half-empty lounges, tourists who came for the slots and stayed for a drink. Some of them recognized the name, most of them didn't care. But tonight felt different. Tonight, a few people actually applauded. A woman in the front row smiled at him, not at his famous last name, but at him, at his voice, at his performance. This is his shot to prove he's not just living off his father's name. And for the first time in his 19 years, it feels like maybe, just maybe, he can do this. The parking lot is dark, cold. The December wind coming off Lake Tahoe cuts through his jacket. He's thinking about calling his mother to tell her the gig went well. Thinking about the drive back to his hotel. Thinking about tomorrow's rehearsal. 2 men approach him in the parking lot. One of them has a gun. John Irwin, 42 years old. A desperate man with a desperate plan. He pulls the gun and puts it against Frank Jr.'s ribs. The metal is cold even through the jacket. Get in the car, don't scream, don't run. Your father's famous, you're famous, we're going to make him pay. And if you cooperate, you'll live. If you don't, well, dead rich kids don't pay ransoms. Frank Jr. freezes. This isn't supposed to happen. This is the kind of thing that happens to movie stars and politicians' kids, not to opening acts in Lake Tahoe lounges. But the gun is real. The fear is real. 72 hours later, Frank Jr. would be returned home safely. The kidnappers would be caught. The ransom would be paid. The FBI would call it a successful resolution. But the relationship between Frank Sinatra and his son, that would never recover. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something in your own life, if it made you think about the relationships that shaped you, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me, did you know about Frank Jr.'s kidnapping? Did you know about the pain behind the Sinatra name? Most people don't, because these are the stories old Hollywood tried to bury. But we're bringing them to light. This channel exists to tell the untold stories, the real stories, not the sanitized versions you see in documentaries, not the glossy magazine articles, the truth, the human truth behind the legends. If you want more stories like this, stories about Dean Martin's hidden depression, Sammy Davis Jr.'s impossible choices, Ava Gardner's tragic love affairs, the secrets the Rat Pack took to their graves, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, because we're just getting started. Every week, we're uncovering another story they didn't want you to know, another truth they buried beneath the glamour, another human being who suffered behind the spotlight. These legends weren't just icons, they were fathers, sons, husbands, flawed, complicated, broken people trying to survive in a world that demanded perfection, and their stories deserve to be told. So if you grew up with this music, if you remember when Sinatra was on every radio, if you remember the night Kennedy was shot, if you remember when Hollywood still meant something, then this channel is for you. Subscribe, join this community, and let's remember these legends the right way. Not as myths, but as human beings. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for caring enough about the truth to make it to the end of this story. I'll see you in the next one. Because during those 72 hours, while his son was held at gunpoint in the trunk of a car, while his son wondered if he would live to see his 20th birthday, Frank Sinatra said something to the FBI that Frank Jr. would never forget. Something that revealed a truth more painful than any ransom demand. Something that proved his father cared more about his reputation, his image, his carefully constructed legend, than his son's life. This is the story they never told you. The story the Sinatra family buried beneath decades of public relations and careful image management. The story that explains why Frank Jr. spent 50 years trying to earn something his father would never give him. The story of how America's greatest entertainer failed the most important performance of his life, being a father. To understand what broke that night in December, you need to understand what Frank Sinatra Jr. was fighting for his entire life. You need to understand the weight of that name, the impossible standard, the shadow that followed him from the moment he took his first breath. Frank Jr. was born on January 10, 1944 at Margaret Haig Maternity Hospital in Jersey City, New Jersey, right in the middle of his father's first imperial phase. Frank Sr. was the biggest star in America. Not just a star, a phenomenon, a cultural force. The Bobby Soxers were fainting in the aisles. The movies were printing money. The music was everywhere. His face was on magazine covers from coast to coast. His voice was on every radio. He was the voice of a generation. And into this world of cameras and screaming fans and sold-out shows and absolute pandemonium came a son who would carry the weight of that name for the rest of his life. Frank Sr. wasn't there for the birth. He was performing in Los Angeles, 3,000 miles away. He sent a telegram. "Congratulations, Nancy. Tell Frank Jr. Welcome to the world. I'll see him when I get back." He got back 3 weeks later. 3 weeks. By the time Frank Sr. held his son for the first time, the baby didn't recognize him, cried when this stranger picked him up. Frank Sr. handed him back to Nancy and said, "He'll get used to me eventually," but he never really did. Growing up as Frank Sinatra's son wasn't a childhood. It was an audition that never ended. Every moment was measured against the legend. Every talent was compared to the voice. Every accomplishment was seen through one lens. But is he as good as his father? The answer, everyone agreed, was no. And they made sure Frank Jr. knew it from the very beginning. Frank Jr. could sing. He had a good voice, smooth, technically proficient, capable of hitting the notes with precision. He understood music theory in ways his father never did. He could read sheet music, arrange harmonies, conduct orchestras, but it wasn't the voice. It didn't have the magic. It didn't make women weep or men reconsider their lives. It was good, professionally good, technically good. But in the shadow of Frank Sinatra, good was the same as failure. When Frank Jr. was 7 years old, his father took him to a recording session. It was supposed to be special, father-son bonding, a rare moment of connection. Frank Sr. was recording Young at Heart at Capitol Records, and he wanted his son to see how music was made, to see the craft, the artistry, the magic. Frank Jr. sat in the booth, watching his father through the glass, watching the musicians hang on his every gesture, watching the engineers scramble to adjust levels the moment Frank Sr. frowned, watching grown men, accomplished musicians, some of them legends in their own right, treat his father like a king, like a god. After the session, one of the session musicians, a trumpet player who'd been with Frank Sr. for years, saw Frank Jr. sitting alone, waiting for his father to finish talking to the producer. "You gonna be a singer like your old man, kid?" Frank Jr., 7 years old, nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I'm gonna be just like my dad. I'm gonna sing and make records." And the trumpet player smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was pitying, sad even. "Good luck with that, kid. Your dad's 1 in a million. Lightning don't strike twice. You might want to have a backup plan." Remembered that moment for the rest of his life. Remembered it in vivid detail. The smell of cigarette smoke in the studio. The way the musician's smile didn't reach his eyes. The feeling in his stomach like he'd been punched. The first time someone told him he'd never be good enough. The first of thousands of times. But the first one stays with you, shapes you, defines you. By the time Frank Jr. was a teenager, his parents' marriage was over, destroyed. Frank Sr. had moved on to Ava Gardner, the love of his life, the woman who would destroy him and rebuild him and destroy him again. The divorce was ugly, public, humiliating. Nancy Sr. held the family together while Frank Sr. was off chasing his grand passion, his epic romance, his own mythology. Frank Jr. watched all of this from the sidelines. He watched his father choose glamour over stability. He watched his mother cry in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. He watched his sisters, Nancy Jr. and Tina, learn to navigate a world where their father was a god to strangers but a ghost to his own family. And Frank Jr. made a decision. He would be different. He would earn his father's respect. He would make his father proud. He would become so good, so talented, so worthy, that his father would have no choice but to see him, really see him, not as a reflection or a reminder or a burden, but as a son. By 1963, Frank Jr. was 19 years old. He dropped out of the University of Southern California after 1 semester. He decided to pursue music professionally, despite everyone telling him it was a mistake, a guaranteed disaster, professional suicide. His mother Nancy begged him to reconsider. She sat him down at the kitchen table, held his hands and said, "Frankie, sweetheart, you don't have to do this. You don't have to follow in your father's footsteps. You can have a normal life. You can be a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or anything you want. You don't have to put yourself through this. The comparisons will never end. They'll destroy you. I'm not following in his footsteps, Mom. I'm making my own path. But they'll never let you. They'll always compare you to him, and that's not fair to you. It's not your fault you're his son. I know it's not fair, but I have to try. I have to know if I can do it." His father's friends pulled him aside at parties and said, "Kid, you don't know what you're walking into. This business will eat you alive. And with your name, they're gonna expect miracles. They're gonna expect you to be him. You ready for that?" His father himself said very little. When Frank Jr. told him about his decision to pursue music, to drop out of college and really commit to singing, Frank Sr. just nodded, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Okay, your life, your choice. But don't come crying to me when it gets hard. I won't be able to help you. People got to see you make it on your own, or they'll say I bought your career. You understand? You're on your own. No encouragement, no pride. No, I believe in you, son. No, you've got talent, kid. No, I'm proud of you for taking a risk. Just don't embarrass me." But Frank Jr. had something to prove. Not to the world, not to the critics, not to the audiences, to his father. So in December 1963, Frank Jr. took a gig at Harrah's Club Lodge in Lake Tahoe. Opening act, small crowd, not the main stage, the lounge, the room where people wandered in between gambling sessions, drinks in hand, attention elsewhere, the room where the ceiling was low and the spotlight was dim and the respect was non-existent. It paid $450 a week. His father was making that much per minute in Vegas, but it was his gig, his crowd, his name on a marquee, even if it was a small marquee, in a small room, in a small casino. For 3 nights, Frank Jr. performed. He sang standards. He sang some of his father's songs. How could he not? The audience expected it, demanded it. He sang some of his own arrangements. He tried to find his voice, his style, his identity in a world where everyone already knew who he was supposed to be. On December 8th, after his last show of the weekend, Frank Jr. felt good, not great. He knew he'd been nervous, knew he'd missed some notes, knew the crowd had been distracted and talking through half his set, but good. Like maybe this could work, like maybe he could do this. He walked out of the casino at 9:15 p.m., his trumpet case in one hand, thinking about the future. That's when his future changed forever. They drove him to Los Angeles, 400 miles in the back of a car, sometimes in the trunk, cramped and suffocating, listening to the road noise and wondering if each mile was bringing him closer to death. Sometimes on the floor with a blanket over him, his face pressed against carpet that smelled like cigarettes and beer. Sometimes sitting up, blindfolded, listening to the kidnappers argue about what to do next. Because the kidnappers weren't professional, they were panicking. John Irwin, 42. Joe Amsler, 23. Barry Keenan, 23. Small-time criminals with a desperate plan. They hadn't thought this through beyond. Kidnap Sinatra's kid, get money, disappear, start a new life somewhere. They didn't have a safe house prepared. They didn't have a foolproof plan. They didn't have connections or resources or experience. They just had desperation and a gun and a wild belief that this would somehow work out. They held him in a house in Canoga Park, a suburb of Los Angeles, a middle-class neighborhood where working families lived, kids playing in the street, Christmas decorations on lawns, families inside eating dinner and watching television and living normal lives. And in one of those houses, behind drawn curtains, Frank Sinatra Jr. sat tied to a chair in a bedroom, wondering if his father would pay to get him back. That was the thought that haunted him during those 72 hours. Not will they kill me, but will my father pay? Because Frank Jr. knew something that the kidnappers didn't. His father was capable of cold calculation. His father was capable of weighing cost versus benefit. His father was capable of protecting his image over everything else. And Frank Jr. wasn't sure which way that calculation would go. The kidnappers made their first ransom call to Frank Sinatra Sr. on December 9th, less than 24 hours after the kidnapping. They demanded $240,000, but not impossible for Frank Sinatra Sr., who was at the absolute peak of his earning power. Frank Sr. was at his compound in Palm Springs when he got the call. He'd been expecting it. The FBI had already contacted him after Lake Tahoe police found Frank Jr.'s room empty, with signs of a struggle. His trumpet was still on the bed. His wallet was gone. The room service tray was untouched. Something was wrong. When the phone rang and a stranger's voice said, "We have your son," Frank Sr.'s first reaction was not panic, not fear, not desperation. It was suspicion. He told the kidnappers, "I'll pay, whatever you want, but I need proof he's alive, and I need to know this is real. It's real, Mr. Sinatra. Very real. Prove it. Put him on the phone." They put Frank Jr. on the phone. His hands were still tied behind his back. One of the kidnappers held the receiver to his ear. "Dad." Frank Jr.'s voice was shaking. He'd been tied to a chair for 18 hours. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. The rope had cut into his wrists until they bled. He was terrified. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt. But Dad, I'm scared. I don't know where I am. They have guns." Frank Sr. cut him off. His voice was cold, controlled, businesslike, like he was negotiating a contract, not talking to his kidnapped son. "Are they treating you okay?" "I guess. But Dad, put them back on." 30 seconds. That's how long Frank Sinatra spoke to his kidnapped son. 30 seconds to verify he was alive. 30 seconds to ask 2 questions. Not "Are you scared?" Not "I'm going to get you home." Not "I love you, son." Not "Stay strong." Not "I'm doing everything I can." Just "Are you hurt? Are they treating you okay?" Put them back on. Frank Jr., sitting in that room with a gun pointed at him, felt something crack inside his chest. A realization. A confirmation of something he'd always suspected but never wanted to believe. His father was going through the motions, checking boxes, doing what was expected, but there was no emotion there, no fear, no desperate love, just procedure, protocol, the same tone he'd use with a business manager or a hotel concierge. After the call, Frank Sr. hung up and turned to his ex-wife, Nancy Sr., who had rushed to Palm Springs the moment she heard the news, driving through the night, barely able to see through her tears. "It's real," Frank Sr. said flatly. "They have him." Nancy Sr. was crying, barely able to speak. "Oh God, Frank, our baby, our boy, what if they hurt him? What if Frank Sr. looked at her with something close to irritation, like her emotions were inconvenient? He's not a baby, Nancy. He's 19, and he'll be fine. I'll pay. They'll let him go. This is business, just business. But that wasn't the moment that broke everything. That came later. The FBI descended on Frank Sr.'s compound within hours. Agents in dark suits, wiretaps, surveillance equipment, recording devices on every phone. They were treating this like a major federal case, which it was. Kidnapping had been a federal crime since the Lindbergh baby. FBI jurisdiction, J. Edgar Hoover's jurisdiction, and the FBI had questions, lots of questions, because Edgar Hoover had a 1,300-page file on Frank Sinatra, mob connections dating back to the 1940s, suspicious associations with organized crime figures, payments that didn't quite add up, relationships with known criminals, and now, suddenly, conveniently, his son was kidnapped. Hoover didn't believe in coincidences. The FBI's working theory, whispered between agents in hushed conversations but never stated officially in reports, was that Frank Sr. had somehow orchestrated this himself. Maybe it was a publicity stunt. His son's singing career was going nowhere. Maybe this would generate sympathy, headlines, attention. Maybe it was mob-related, a message being sent, a debt being paid, a favor being called in. Maybe it was a tax scheme. Pay the ransom, claim it as a business loss, launder some money through a fake kidnapping. They didn't have evidence, but they had suspicion. Deep institutional suspicion of Frank Sinatra that went back decades. And Frank Sinatra, sitting in his living room, surrounded by FBI agents taking notes and recording everything, and watching him with barely concealed doubt, knew exactly what they were thinking. So on December 10th, during a briefing session with FBI agents, while his son was still missing, still tied to a chair in a house in Canoga Park, still wondering if he'd live through this, Frank Sinatra made a choice. He chose to protect himself. Special Agent Thomas Kelly asked a routine question. Mr. Sinatra, is there any possibility this is not legitimate? Is there anyone who might have put your son up to this? Any reason to believe this could be staged? It was a standard question. The FBI asked it in every kidnapping case because occasionally, kidnappings were hoaxes, insurance scams, publicity stunts gone wrong. But this was different. This was his son. Frank Sr. paused. He looked at the agent. He looked at his ex-wife Nancy, who was sitting across from him, crying, barely holding herself together. He looked at his daughter Nancy Jr., who had rushed home, pale and terrified. And Frank Sinatra made a calculation. A cold, political, self-protective calculation. He said, I don't know, I don't think so, but I have to be honest with you. Frank Jr.'s been desperate for attention lately. He wants to be a singer. He's frustrated that it's not working out. He's jealous of his sister's success. Nancy's got a recording career. Tina's doing well. And Frank Jr., he's struggling. He's been emotional, unstable even. So I don't know, I hope this is real. I hope he's safe, and this is just criminals being criminals. But I don't know, I can't say for certain. You have to consider all possibilities, right? The agent wrote it down, every word, in the official FBI report that would sit in government archives for decades. Nancy Sinatra Sr. stared at her ex-husband in absolute horror. Frank, what are you saying? How can you even suggest? Frank Sr. turned to her, his face hard, defensive. I'm saying I don't know, Nancy. I'm being honest. The FBI needs to know everything. They need to consider every angle. And the truth is, you know it as well as I do. Frank Jr. has been desperate. He's been making poor decisions. This singing thing, maybe he thought this would help his career. I'm just saying, we have to be realistic. Realistic. Our son is missing. He's been kidnapped. And you're suggesting he would fake this for attention. What kind of father says that? A smart one. One who doesn't let emotions cloud his judgment. The words hung in the air like poison. The ransom drop happened on December 11th, 1963. 3 days after the kidnapping, Frank Sr. paid the $240,000 in cash. Small bills. The FBI photographed every serial number. The kidnappers, in their profound stupidity, released Frank Jr. almost immediately. They shoved him out of the car at a highway rest stop, just outside Los Angeles, at 2:47 a.m. Frank Jr. stood there in the dark, still in the same clothes from 3 days ago, unwashed, unfed, exhausted, traumatized, and he wondered, what now? He didn't have money. He didn't have ID. He walked to a payphone and made a collect call. Dad, they let me go. I'm at a rest stop. I need someone to come get me. Where are you exactly? Frank Jr. gave him the location. I'll send someone. Stay there. Dad, can you come? But Frank Sr. had already hung up. Frank Sr. sent a driver. Not himself. Not his ex-wife. A driver. When Frank Jr. finally arrived at his father's compound, it was dawn. The house was full of people, FBI agents, press outside the gates. This was a media event now. Frank Sr. walked over and hugged him, a big theatrical hug. But Frank Jr. could feel the stiffness, the performance. His father was hugging him for the cameras. When they pulled apart, Frank Sr. eyes were assessing. "You okay?" "I think so." "Good. The FBI wants to talk to you. Tell them everything." The FBI arrested the kidnappers within 48 hours. They were idiots, and Frank Sr., who had just paid $240,000 and endured 3 days of scrutiny, felt humiliated. He'd been made to look like a victim by small-time losers. A few days later, Frank Sr. visited Frank Jr. at his mother's house. According to Frank Jr., as later testimony, his father said, "You embarrassed me. This whole thing, it made me look weak. The FBI thinks I set it up. The mob thinks I'm soft. You should have fought them. You should have escaped." Frank Jr. stared at his father. "I had a gun to my head. I've had a gun to my head. You fight. You don't just surrender." That was the moment. Frank Jr. realized his father would never see him as anything other than a disappointment. The trial began in February 1964. Frank Jr. testified for 2 days. The defense attorneys floated a desperate theory. Maybe Frank Jr. had staged his own kidnapping for attention. When reporters asked Frank Sr. about this theory, he said, "I don't think that's what happened, but I understand why people might wonder. Frank Jr. has been struggling. I don't think he'd do something like this. But I understand the question. I understand the question." Frank Jr., hearing this, understood. His father would rather protect his reputation than defend his son unconditionally. The kidnappers were convicted. Frank Jr. went back to his life. But everything had changed. After the trial, Frank Jr. made a decision. He would never ask his father for help. For 50 years, he sang in small venues, wedding gigs, casinos, any gig that paid. In the 1980s, Frank Sr. offered him a job as musical director. Frank Jr. took it, not because he forgave his father, but because work was work. There's a recording from 1991. Frank Sr. is at Carnegie Hall. He stops mid-concert and says, "My son is conducting tonight. Being a father, it's harder than any performance. I wasn't the father I should have been. Frank Jr., if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I protected myself instead of you." The audience applauded, but Frank Jr. had tears in his eyes. It wasn't enough. 30 years too late. After Frank Sr. died in 1998, a reporter asked Frank Jr. if he'd forgiven his father. Frank Jr. said, "The kidnapping didn't break me. What broke me was realizing my father loved Frank Sinatra more than he loved me. I made peace with it." "So you forgave him?" "No, I just stopped waiting for him to be someone he wasn't." Frank Sinatra Jr. died in 2016. In his wallet they found a faded newspaper clipping from 1963. Sinatra's son kidnapped. Why did he carry it? Maybe it was the only time his father was thinking about him, even if those thoughts were doubts. The Frank Sinatra story isn't just about the music. It's about a man who conquered the world but lost his son. It's about a father who could perform love for strangers but couldn't give it to the person who needed it most. Frank Sinatra Jr. survived those 72 hours, but he never recovered from his father's doubt, and neither did Frank Sinatra Sr. That doubt haunted him until the end. That's the untold story. The story of a father's failure and a son's survival. The story of Frank Sinatra Jr., a man who spent his life trying to be seen by a father too busy looking at himself.